What is fantasy? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is fantasy? The standard definition of fantasy is a creative imagination's application into reality, usually manifesting in what they call a genre of art called fiction that deals with supernatural or fanciful artistic hallmarks. So basically, fantasy is the application of one's imagination. So why does it play such a prevalent part in human life? And why has it been with us for so long? And why is it always relegated to fiction? So I guess the first part about it being relegated to fiction is kind of easy because we're dealing with projections of things that really express like psychological desires, and fantasy is probably the primary tool for exercising the imagination. And when we look at a human being and how a human being is constituted, and we recognize the fact that human beings are, out of all of the creatures on Earth, have the most ability to consciously create environments and realities within the world. And when we look at a human being from that perspective, and then we go through how a human's constituted in terms of their biological makeup, and what organs they have and what faculties they have in order to create things in the reality, when you go through all of the parts of a human in regards to creation, the lens at which we get to that interacts between thoughts and creating the reality can really best be described as imagination. And expressing imagination and bringing imagination into the world as a focused tool lends itself to fantasy. Because in the projection of fantasy, which is a combination, it's an overlay of things that we would like to happen, utilizing the idea of supernatural events, mystical events, abilities that go beyond the regular third dimension physics. The imagination overlays these psychological needs and wishes and desires onto the third dimensional reality. And that's typically what, when we watch like fantasy movies or read fantasy literature, really what you're experiencing in is the blending of the desire of creative psychological needs being laid over the third dimensional baseline reality. And so that's what you get. That's when you get, sword and sorcery stories. You get fairy tales. You get really most science fiction is really fantasy more than science fiction. Science fiction is sort of an attempt to put into really practical technological terms a fantasy. Right? Like Star Wars is really a fantasy picture because there's no basis in reality for human beings or other beings being able to go around and telekinetically choke people out or, do any of the Jedi stuff the Jedis do. Those are all supernatural abilities, So that actually makes it fantasy. It's not really science fiction. Now, fantasy is an integral part to the evolution of the human species. Because for all the things that we fantasize about that may not actually be possible ever, there are a significant portion of things that people fantasize about that are in fact latent abilities of human beings that are either suppressed or ignored or outright denied. And those abilities are also expressed in fantasy, and they're safely expressed in fantasy, and they're free from critique in fantasy. So in terms of the development of these skill sets and the development of the ability to have vision on the supernatural world, which does exist and has been scientifically documented and verified a million different ways. And remember, according to the scientific method, for a thing to exist, all you have to do is document its existence one time. That's all that is required by science to say, oh, the supernatural world exists. All you have to do is get a ghost on film once. All you have to do is get a spectrometer reading of a ghost once. All you have to do is get a UFO on tape once. Well, all of those things have occurred many, many times over at this point. So science itself has proven that the supernatural world does in fact exist. That's not in dispute. The only people who dispute that are ignorant people or people who have cottage industries based around the supernatural not existing. It's been well documented for millennia, really. And so fantasy allows us to rise above essentially just scientific critique and project into a world a whole bunch of different things, like a full spectrum of potentiality. And we can really stack it out with a whole bunch of stuff. Now, of course, in fantasy, it doesn't mean that everything they're putting into a fantasy is a real ability or a real thing that can occur or whatever. But it is saying that many of the things that are put in there that we think aren't actually are. So right off the bat, that explains the utility of fantasy in the human species and why it's been around for so long. It's literally in every single culture to ever exist. It doesn't matter if you're an Aboriginal tribesman 5,000 years ago or you're a first world, moviegoer today. Everybody has fantasy. Fantasy stories are the ones that really last because they express universal human psychological needs and desires. And human psychological needs and desires are, in fact, universal. Even the most eccentric, eclectic, bespoke fantasies of like the most particular people, at their core, are still universal. They're all some variation on, sex, food, success, creation, fulfillment, closure, sense of worth, self-awareness. Like they're all universal. They're all universal human needs. And that's why fantasy always resonates. And that's why fairy tales from 500 years ago still exist today, because they directly address universal human psychological needs. And that's why, when you travel cultures, especially when you travel cultures that have actual ancient history to them, millennia worth of history, they will have tales that survive 500 generations or whatever. And it's because when something resonates through even just a few generations, the only way that something resonates for more than a few generations is because it's resonating with universal human needs. And humans, as they're generated generation after generation, at their core have the same hardware. And fantasy is kind of like the software. Like fantasy is where the hardware of what's going on in the human mind, and when you like break down all the stuff with like, third eye and crown chakra and all this other stuff, when you go in with the context that it's all set up because humans are creator gods, and when they turn it on, they can project through their skull into the reality things that they desire to happen, then you realize the important software position that fantasy has. Because fantasy gives you a spot where you can collect the data from the real world, you can get in touch with yourself and determine what your fantasies, like what your psychological needs are, what your mental needs are, all those things, in coordination with universal frequency, aka God, and then put it in an overlay to your own personal environment that you happen to be existing in. And it gives you a space where you can do that internally without projecting it out first. That's one of the key components. That's one of the key utilities of fantasy, is that you can keep it internal and you can sort through all the different things and determine what your actual like wishes and desires and all those things are. And many will be self-centered and many will be altruistic and everything in between. But fantasy gives us that spot to really explore our personal preferences about many things. And then it also allows us to get comfortable with the idea that we have supernatural abilities and that others have supernatural abilities, which is true. And that's so that you can deal with all that before you start to externalize it in any manner, whether you want to try to like live it out, whether you want to turn it into a piece of media or art or whatever it is you want to do with that, once you get that concept into your mind. Ancient anthropologists have studied the daily time cycles of hunter-gatherers. And they came to a conclusion, and this is before humans formed villages, they came to a conclusion that in a given like work week, the process of finding food and shelter and all the other things they did only occupied about 20 to 25 hours per week of what they were doing. And they said that what they were doing, the vast majority of the rest of the time, was entertaining themselves. That's what an integral part of the human condition, entertainment, is. And it's because we're creator gods and we need to fill our heads with new ideas and new concepts and constantly be aware of our environment so we know how to alchemize the environment to create new ones. So the majority of their time was not spent hunting and gathering or fighting off wild animals or anything, because they would basically just find some, duck into a cave, find some high trees, find some safe areas, find water and food for the day and stick around for a bit based on weather. And then basically it was story time. They just have to sit around and like figure out how to entertain themselves, which means that their brain was operating essentially the same as ours, right? So the evolutionary aspects of it, it's not necessarily that our hardware got better. It's just that the collective experiences throughout the timeline created it so that now we have access to a library of experiences in our DNA that are vast. And they're great for entertainment. And guess what? They're perfect fodder for fantasy. And fantasy is that spot where we can start to make good use of all of this DNA library of experience that everybody has, because now we're this deep into the evolution of the species. And now it's essential for us to use fantasy to try to create a better future. Because at this particular moment in time, everyone can see that like basically human history books are nothing but a catalog of ineffectual wars. They kill a lot of people, but they don't actually affect any real change. The wars have been going on, according to human history books, nonstop for close to 10 millennia. And they haven't really changed anything. Which is why we have a need for fantasy, because fantasy is the key to the mental aspect of projecting ourselves out of this particular Earth cycle. And when we can get out of this particular Earth cycle, which is a pointless one, then we can start unlocking these innate supernatural abilities that every human being is born with. And we can project a future that is much more in line with fantasy than with what the history books have been documenting us doing. And so that's really the key utility to fantasy. And fantasy has no limits. Like, fantasy allows us to use all of our capabilities and project whatever we need to, so that we can use our full creative powers. It's sort of the area where we can really integrate, incorporate, and project our full creative capabilities. And that's when we can start to optimize the species and the human individual, is when we're allowed to and encouraged to unlock these latent abilities that we all have. And fantasy is really the key to do that. So what is fantasy? It's a key to a brighter future for humanity. Well, thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. I hope you found it helpful. And as always, have fun.